This episode of the EPS podcast contains strong language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I am Eric Paul. You can find the EPS podcast on all sorts of social media, Instagram, Facebook. There's also a Patreon page, patreon.com/EPS podcast, and the website, epspodcast.club. Today is pretty exciting. It seems like every episode I have something new that I haven't done yet, and I guess that's easy to do when you only have 25 episodes. But I am glad to have on the podcast today another podcaster, and on top of that, a stand-up comedian and a historian. I think that those things go so well together. But I have today Don Brodey, and I'm so glad we finally made this happen.
Yes.
So Don is the host of the HILF podcast, which is History I'd Love to Find More Out About, right?
See, I had a feeling that would be hard, especially you're a social studies teacher, right? So
Yeah.
I would imagine this word does not come trippingly off your tongue. But yes, the podcast is called HILF, History I'd Like to. And it is me researching some of the historical subjects and characters and events that myself and my guests find the most interesting, those little nuggets from history, characters, wars, meetings, encounters that you remember hearing about from history class or you saw in a History Channel episode and you want to know more about. And so I read books and watch documentaries and really familiarize myself, could do a historian's deep dive, and then I serve that history up raw.
Yeah. Now you're doing a live recording of that next month, right? You're doing your show, and I wanted to ask. So, as a comedian, a stand-up comedian, as well as a podcaster, it seems like a live recording of your podcast is like a meeting of both those worlds. Do you foresee it being remarkably different right from the get-go, though, from what you do on stage as a stand-up?
I'm very curious to see how it will go, actually, because it is so many things that I'm really familiar with and do a lot, but never converging at the same time, which, can always be an interesting thing. It's like, maybe your favorite chili doesn't go with your pasta Alfredo in the same bowl,
Right.
even though they're both delicious, maybe it's not going to work. But I'm excited about it. I have been a theater performer and have performed live improvisational sketch and stand-up comedy for decades. It's what I've been doing forever. And the podcast is new, though. You said you have 25 episodes. You beat me. My 14th episode is the current one that is up right now. So I'm new to podcasting. But I have done like a lot of variety shows and interview style shows, and I've produced and hosted such a wide variety of live performance styles that I'm very confident that this is going to be a blast. I think what's going to be different is, if you've listened to my show before, it sounds like you have, which I love, is a lot of my guests are stand-up comedians also. People I know from the comedy community. And so for my live performance, which is on May 26th in Glendale, California, I have a stand-up comedian. She's going to perform a 10-minute set. She's going to do her stand-up first. Then we're going to sit down with two mics and do sort of my usual podcast recording, but there'll be a live audience. So incorporating their reactions and occasionally turning it to them will be a new element, obviously, something that we don't do as we're just sitting here chatting. And I will be miking it differently. So I have a sound guy who's going to mic not only myself and my guest, but also a dedicated mic for the audience, so that when I mix and edit this for someone just listening in their headphones, they'll be able to hear kind of a balance of what was happening in the room. So it's going to be a challenge, but
it sounds like something that, and I know that a lot of comedians have turned to podcasting. It seems like a natural progression kind of thing. I mean, the same reason why a lot of comedians just do great on morning talk shows, Howard Stern or a local market one, or even host their own, because it's just like that, slightly different perspective on world events. There's a slightly different, I guess I'll use that word again, perspective. Just, the comedian sees things differently and reports it right back at us so much differently, but just enough for us to relate to and to be funny. And it's like, it only makes sense that you would go to this as your next venture.
Yeah,
That
that's the goal. That's the goal. And it's funny. I felt like I was the last stand-up comedian in LA that didn't have a podcast. And I used to say, I don't have a podcast because some asshole has to listen to all this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you guys all need somebody to tune in who can listen to all these stuff. But no, it's true. It's a microphone. It's an opportunity for you to share your twisted perspective on any given subject. So you're right. It is kind of a natural draw.
And that's what I'm glad we're connecting on this, because I want to talk about, usually my program is about taking a specific thing and analyzing it and trying to see what that tells us about the time period from which it came. Whereas today, I just want to talk about stand-up comedy as it exists and see if we can nail down when. I feel like there's a current trajectory of stand-up that has been going on for a few decades now, maybe even, half a century or more, of, the delivery of a comic, the kinds of topics that you cover. Even I think the microphone makes the biggest difference. Just the way a comedian even just holds the microphone and uses it as part of the act. I feel like we need to, trace it to its, like, where did that start? Because in the last I'd say the last 20 years or so, there've been attempts by comics to try new things, use like projector screens or something like that, or incorporate musical numbers or different kinds of things. But it always the most successful ones always go back to just traditional, I'm standing here with a microphone and I'm telling my jokes, like that seems to be that place. So the first question I always ask when it comes to any kind of primary source is, what material is it made from? And moments before I recorded my first episode a couple months ago, I had a moment where I was like, material, for like a museum or something like that, for a historian, material is like what it's actually physically made out of. But for somebody like a comedian, that's a term that's used a lot, right? Is material. I can always like hear, I don't know if he ever actually said it, but I can hear Jerry Seinfeld's voice, like, you stole my material, like it's part of, what, Banya, so where does a comedian, and we'll start with yourself, where do you get your material?
Well, it's a really good observation that we as creative people, stand-up comedians, use a similar word that a contractor or a construction worker, would use.
Yeah.
Because we are generally taking materials and building something from it, right? You're taking the materials from your mother's death, your childhood, your senior prom, your day at work. That's the material from which you build and construct a joke. And we do use those terms too. You build a joke, you construct a joke, you reorganize or structure a joke. And it's why somebody may say you stole my material, but it would almost be a misnomer, because you can't steal material in the same way that, like, if you and I are both architects, the creative thing that we're building and the creative thing that we sell is the design of the building or the building itself.
Right.
But we may share material. We may share bricks, traumatic childhood stories. We may share that. You know what I mean? Right. We may both tell jokes about the Super Bowl. We may both tell jokes about the same event, like the slap, the Oscars slap. So in that sense, you can't really steal someone's material because the material is out there.
Yeah.
What you can steal is their structure. So the thing that would make a comedian really mad is if you actually took their joke, took their punchline. And you can also, that's the kind of thing that is also the sort of thing that you could sort of prove, that you and I both have a joke about our senior prom is incidental because we both had senior proms, and maybe we both had a similar event happen at that senior prom. But if you really heard a joke of mine, and then you took that joke and told that punchline as if it was something you wrote, that's like where you get into like immoral,
and that seems to be, and that actually might help a lot with tracking down when this all began, because pre-recording comedy sets, before people were recording things and putting it on wax, putting it on record or anything like that, it would be very difficult for one comic to be able to prove or even confront somebody else by saying
Yeah.
because what evidence do you have unless
Sure.
somebody's actually recording it?
Sure.
And
Well,
then
and
it's a
even it's a really good point, and it was almost like stealing jokes wasn't even really a thought, in the sense that you could, and it was you were well within bounds creatively to reinvent something that you saw on stage before. So you used to have like set bits, like in the vaudevillian days of, like, the minstrel shows in vaudeville, the
yeah,
early performing days. There were bits that like everybody did.
yeah,
Like you might have, for example, you'd have your caricature of the Irish guy, your caricature of the Italian guy, your caricature of the German guy, which is where we get the Marx Brothers.
hmm,
Groucho is the, Italian guy.
yep,
Harpo's the Italian guy. You know what I mean? Like, and so any given troupe would have this sort of thing, and no one would see that and be like, you stole that from the Marx
right,
Brothers. It was just sort of understood that that was the bit you were doing. But once comedians started telling really personal jokes about their life, like, Kevin Hart talks about his cousins and his immediate family and stuff like
yeah,
that. Obviously, you can't steal that joke. You can't tell that joke as if it's yours,
yeah.
because it's not,
You can't be. My uncle got knocked out too.
Yes,
I love
yes,
that
that's
bit.
right. That's right.
In the exact same way. I've been throughout most of my life. I love stand-up comedy. I remember, I think Comedy Central used to have a show called Stand Up, where they'd have like a topic and then they'd show a bunch of different comedians, takes on it. And I was listening to comedy CDs, for most of my life. I used to, when downloading became a thing, I would download I must have listened to like Chris Rock's Bigger and Blacker
Yeah,
100 times, just over and over again, listening to it and never losing the enjoyment out of it. But I've never had the guts to actually try stand up. I don't think I'd be very good at it. But when I used to think about like a funny joke or something like that, it was so hard because I'm like, wait a minute, I have to like almost cycle through my own internal Rolodex, be like, no, I'm pretty sure Dennis Leary actually did that one. I
oh,
can't,
funny.
I can't, if I came up with that joke, I'd have to like, cross-reference it a bunch of times, make sure I
Yeah,
didn't just get it, from some other point of view, or
sure.
some other comedian, not that I'm a comedian, but somebody else. And so I was like, I just kind of gave up on that as, I'm like, well, I couldn't do that because I'd be too afraid of knowing that I was just kind of inheriting that.
Sure. Well,
But
especially with Twitter too. I mean, you never know who that morning has tweeted out a punchline. It's why they say for new comics that you generally want to tell jokes that are about yourself, your personal experience, your life, your family.
yeah,
Not only because you may accidentally be jumping in on something, but usually there's 10 to 20 comedians from around the world who are a gazillion following, on all
mhm,
social media, and they are going to be blasting out hot takes and their perspective on everything that's in the news and all the current events. So you
yeah.
almost sort of leave it to them to make the big observations about what everyone is seeing, unless you really have a unique hot take on it. But usually, even that is going to come back to your personal experience.
Right. So, how it was made is another question I always ask. And for this one, I want to talk about how important the microphone is to stand-up comedy. The microphone has been around since the late 19th century. I've seen comedians on television without a microphone. It always looks weird,
Yeah.
and there's kind of hands, or, because it's funny because like those late night talk shows, um, which are basically a complete, just carryover of the mid 20th century. Whenever they have, so a lot of times the host is a comedian by trade, but they do their monologue without a microphone. But then if they have a comic on that night, they always give them a microphone, because it's
Yeah.
like you almost like need that tool. How important is the microphone to stand up?
Your observations seem so similar to mine. It is really important. Sometimes it's important for its actual form and function, which is you can get it really close.
Yeah.
You can say something very subtle. When
Hmm.
you have, so some of it is knocking. There's comedians that do a lot of whatever. Dave Chappelle, if you watch him, hits the microphone on his leg a lot.
Yeah.
he sort of does like a "that's so funny" and hits it on his like. So there are some actual auditory things that you can use the microphone to do that are just technical, you know. But yeah, I feel like it is sort of a security blanket. It's like this is just what a micro, you know, you hold it.
Yeah.
And sometimes even I know a lot of comedians when they are practicing their bits, whether there's an audience or not, will have to hold something when they rehearse their jokes, because if you rehearse without it and all of a sudden you're on stage, just having something in your hand can feel very strange. Even just the process. I know a lot of people when they first start off with comedy, it's really tricky to, you know, you get on stage and then you take the microphone out and then you put the stand behind you and then you start. And sometimes just that moment fills people with so much anxiety, you know, the moment before they start. But yeah, I mean, part of it started with, like I said, back in the vaudeville original minstrel shows, there was no amplification, but it also wasn't necessary. They were generally pretty small venues, or the acoustics were such that they weren't necessary. But a lot of times the monologuist, before we even had the word stand up, which was just an individual who told jokes. So it wasn't a partner, it wasn't a dual telling jokes. It wasn't a musician, it wasn't a clown. It was just one person standing and talking by themselves to be funny, which was sort of the innovation. But it was done technically usually to cover something happening backstage. So they would actually close the curtain so that they could be changing sets or changing costumes or doing something with the show behind them. And this person was there to cover. So sometimes a microphone was necessary, even if it wasn't necessary for anything else that was being performed, because there was actual noise going on behind them.
Yeah.
So the microphone was useful because they were there to cover something that was noisy. So they then needed to be amplified.
I love how that works out, that something that came out completely as an essential thing that, you know, it was done to mask and cover up.
I do know one, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do know one comedian I perform with pretty regularly, who is one of the only ones I know who doesn't use a mic. He uses a headset. Christopher Titus. He had the show Titus on
I remember that.
Years in Comedy Central.
Bill Bellamy did that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and he does a lot of stand up around LA, and every time I've seen him, he has both hands free and he's wearing a Britney Spears headphone.
I'd always be worried that somebody from the Burger King drive-in would get on there by accident, and you know, end up like, wait, hold on a second.
What a dream! Be a gift.
Like, hold on. You know, the whole idea of something being, you know, it's funny. I was on a cruise about 10 years ago in the British Isles, and we were in Scotland, and we were outside Edinburgh, and they had the Grand Royal Tattoo. It's the big show where all the bagpipers and all that, but super expensive. So those of us who scraped up just enough money to take the cruise got like a tiny version of it on the ship. And so it was like 10 people, and they kept coming on doing all these different songs. But the opposite happened, where they accidentally left their microphone on backstage. So there was this woman, and she was doing this beautiful you know, Scottish folk violin performance, but in the background we could just hear like guys in the back, you know, like changing, like, and they're like laughing, and you know, I don't know what they were doing. I was like, so it's like the exact opposite of where the microphone was intended for, is to mask all that stuff.
Funny. That's so funny. That's exactly right. And it's almost always there was a technician who screwed up, because it is very rarely left in the hands of the actors.
Yeah.
To determine when their own microphones are on. Everyone knows that is a disastrous scenario. So
and it's like, oh, no wonder you guys do these kinds of performances instead of at the, you know, castle where you're supposed to be. But so I guess, I mean, the microphone is essential. And so would you say that when, you know, they've been around for so long, but when it's become, you know, when somebody takes that technique, because I know like Bing Crosby is like, I know he's not a comedian, but you know, that crooning style of singing, you know, where he could actually sing very, you know, deep baritone softly, because the microphone is right there. You didn't need to project at all. That started a whole generation of that kind of singing, where, you know, you get to the modern era, it's kind of weird to have a crooner, because it's like, well, the microphones are better now. Like they have better technology. You don't need to, you know, hold it so close and all that, but it's created a whole form. So I feel like with comedians, the kind of microphone that has arrived, the kind that you can detach from the stand, hold in your hand, maybe not quite the Bob Barker tiny microphone thing, but just the one that's very mobile, just classic. That almost sets like the beginning of the modern comedian era. And so would you put that at like 60s or so, as far as when the form of comedy that's kind of taken over?
That's a good question. Actually, yeah, I guess so. I mean, Lenny Bruce, I feel like Lenny Bruce was sort of one of the forefathers of modern stand-up in that sense. And he obviously would have had the technology and the trappings of a microphone, but also being in a small bar setting, you know what I mean, versus a traveling troupe, speaking really rawly and really intimately about the observations he's making in his own personal life, talking about sex and drugs and the government and stuff like that. And that was the 50s.
Okay.
That was the 50s and the 60s. And then I think George Carlin kind of perfected it in the 60s and 70s. So I think I would say slightly earlier than the 60s, with that 1950s Lenny Bruce sort of style, but yeah, I think right around there. And then really after Carlin, I think that you hit the stride of like the comedy boom of the 1980s, which was the comedy club, where you have venues that are not featuring crooners and magicians and dog acts. It's just comedian after comedian after comedian after comedian. It is a comedy club. There might be a jazz band playing behind the comedians, but that's incidental. You know what I mean? I think that really came around in the 50s.
Yeah. And so as far as like its own form of entertainment, and all that is also reflective of, all kinds of entertainment, recreation, leisure activities is also a reflection of what the audience has time for. I know that with the vaudeville, burlesque, minstrel shows of the late 19th century, those were the working class, Lower East Side of Manhattan style of entertainment, where 20 all day long burlesque, because people didn't really have shifts at work. They would just they would get off from whatever they were doing, and if they wanted a beer or something to drink and be entertained at the same time, that's where they went. It wasn't like we have a weekend now, it's Friday night, where should we go? I've been to a few comedy clubs and where that's all they do is comedy, and they don't have midweek shows. It's always Friday, Saturday night. I was a couple of years ago, I saw Patton Oswalt in Boston. He wasn't performing, he wasn't doing stand-up, he was promoting a book. And he was answering questions in this big lecture hall, and an aspiring comedian raised her hand and asked, how do I get going on this? I try to go to as many clubs as possible and, perform as much as possible, open night mics and everything like that. And he said, well, nowadays it's all about, he's like, if you have a smartphone in your pocket, you have a recording studio, you have a TV set, studio right there, record yourself like crazy, get yourself out there. And that's something that obviously comics as recent as the 90s didn't have as much access to. It was really something that is very modern, let alone any other time before that. So it's almost like the comedy club even has its competition now, where it's like you could just watch YouTube and see the comedies and stuff. But so from you personally, I have you here, so I'm very glad about that. I need to ask about your own career with this. What made you want to pursue stand-up? What was the inspiration for yourself?
Well, I think it started with just a general passion for performing live. I started out as a theater performer, and I love all styles of live performance. But I've always been drawn to comedy. And I think that it might be because I mean, who doesn't like laughter? And as a performer, it is such an immediate understanding of if the audience likes it or not. You can be playing Juliet killing yourself, 6 nights a week on stage. And with the exception of the applause at the end, people from your perspective on stage sound exactly the same if they are tremendously moved by grief or bored out of their minds. So, but when they laugh, it's, you can pretend to laugh, but not for an hour,
Right.
So there is this just real immediate gratification as a live performer with laughter. And then I did a lot of improvisational comedy, team and sketch comedy, like Comedy Sports and improv teams and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And I write a lot of comedy. And I would host and MC events, which was sort of pseudo comedy. I wasn't standing there telling jokes, but I'm the funny, lighthearted one that sort of lubricates
Right.
an otherwise sort of dry, meeting. But I didn't do stand up sort of formally or officially until I moved to Los Angeles in 2014.
Mhm.
That was the first time, because there is stand up everywhere here. I
Right.
mean, it is obviously a film town, and that's why I moved here. But there is a comedy club, there is a mic and an amp and some way to perform stand-up comedy every hour of
Yeah.
every day in every neighborhood of this giant, beautiful city. And so what started as a curiosity, I think, I think I'd like stand-up. I think I'd be good at it. I heard I'd be good at it. It turned into an immediate opportunity. I took a class. I wrote my first set, wrote some jokes, hit the clubs, and was very lucky. It really just kind of took off after that. And I'm going strong.
That's incredible. I mean, and would you say that the reason why there's so many comedy clubs is just because of the show business history of Los Angeles, that everyone, if you're not currently involved in making a movie or TV show, you're practicing your craft by getting into all those clubs as much as you can. There's just so much talent, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. There's a lot. People come out here largely to make it in show business to some extent. And if they started anything like me in live performance, there's not a lot of opportunity to do live performing on stage. And if you do get cast in a play, sometimes that can be a real problem, because you'll get cast in a TV show or a commercial or a movie, and their turnover goes so fast, faster than a rehearsal schedule. So theater companies are sort of notoriously losing cast members to TV shows and movies, even when there is a live show. And stand-up doesn't require you being with a theater company or having a rehearsal or getting cast even. It's a real self-propelling sort of thing,
Yeah.
And also TV and movies, as you well know, have always kind of loved comedians. So it's a push me, pull you, in the sense that if a stand-up comedian wants to get a sitcom, this is the town to be in.
Right.
And if a sitcom is looking for a great new host or character lead for their concept idea, the comedy clubs are a great place to go find them. So it ends up being sort of a mutually
it's like a beehive almost of every, just, constantly, always there.
And everybody thinks they can try it. I've seen some really, really amazing actors, prolific, famous actors who have just bombed, thought they could jump up on stage and try stand up, and everybody was very excited to see them, and it was not funny.
Not good at all. And that has everything to do with, I think you're right. It's just like the misunderstanding of what it is. Like when you go on stage, do you ever, I'm assuming that you have some version of like a set list, maybe not to the Janine Garofalo style of actually having it written down on stage with you, but that what you want to talk about. But do you ever edit while you're in the middle of a set? Like where you're like, I don't think that's going to go over well with this crowd, or
usually a lot of that is written in advance. I mean, usually you're working within a timeline. So usually when you're doing a show, especially at the level I'm at, if you're not headlining, a headliner is going to do at least 30 minutes of material. But if you're in like a lineup of comics, sort of like everybody's doing 10 minutes or everybody's doing 15 minutes, or 3 people will do 8 minutes and then the headliner will do 45, so it's sort of determined by time. And so often you're doing your set. I'm going to do my 5 minutes on Wisconsin, or I'll do my 10-minute set of being a mom, or I'll do the 8-minute set about love life. You know what I mean? So you usually have your stand-up sets based on sort of the category, the overlying theme of that set, and then approximately how long it takes for you to tell that whole set if you were to tell all the jokes. And so usually within those sets, you go, oh, that set wouldn't, like, if, I'm booked at this, comedy club in Palm Springs. I might come with a set that I think will sort of fit for Palm Springs. But then all of a sudden I get into the room and I realize I thought maybe it was going to be a bunch of retired gays, which is often what you find in Palm Springs. And I was completely mistaken. These are a bunch of young women who are here for a bachelorette kind of weekend. And that may or may not change the set that I'm going to do. But rarely will I change a joke on stage. Like if I'm already going to do this set and tell this joke, I'm probably not going to backpedal or change a joke midstream because of the crowd.
Yeah.
Sometimes I might only soften the language, say dong instead of dick, or, so just kind of soften because I feel like maybe they're not digging the foul language, or maybe the host or the venue has requested cleaner language, or sometimes if you're the MC, which is often my job, you're the host and MC for the night. It's not like nobody can swear, but it's just sort of understood that the host and MC shouldn't set the tone that's more foul than what might come after. So a little bit of that, but for the most part, you've decided in advance. Every now and again, I do find I'm surprised. There was a show I did last week. I was doing 2 shows in a night. I did a 7:00 show followed by a 9:00 show in the same theater. And I have a set where I talk about throwing your panties at rock stars. And at the end of my joke, I throw a giant pair of panties at the audience. And it's fun and it's funny and people love it. And I forgot that I had 2 shows. And so I only brought 1 pair of panties.
Oh, no.
So I did the first show and, the serving staff is turning the room over and I went to get, and I was like, oh no, I don't have my panties. So right before I went on stage, I had to quick decide to tell a different 10-minute set that didn't require that. And I know all my jokes, but I wasn't really ready to tell that set. And I didn't know I was going to be telling that set tonight. And that can work and it cannot work. And for me, it really worked. It ended up working out really well because the joke felt kind of new and fresh because I was completely taken off guard and was telling it new and fresh. So
much of it is about reading the room in that moment and being able to, as a teacher, I can relate, not that we have nearly exact same job, but
more similar than I'd probably realize.
I mean, I find myself kind of when I teach a lesson, and we're really encouraged or discouraged from doing a straight lecture for the, most schools do block scheduling. So it's like 80-minute, 90-minute long blocks. And just to talk for the whole time is ridiculous. Yeah. But I almost follow the same pattern as like my favorite late night host is Conan O'Brien. And so I kind of follow the same. I have like an opening monologue in a way where, I pepper in, my own sense of humor into that. And then by the end of class, my eyes are always on the clock for everything. And I know that comedians, you have in the back of the house, somebody who'll flash a flashlight to tell you, when to wrap things up and things like that. And so it's the same kind of idea where I have, stories or anecdotes that I'll cycle in depending on what I'm teaching about. And I always try, keep my eye on the clock. Okay, that one takes about 6 minutes to relate to them. So I, as the, time is winding down and everything like that. But one thing that I've recognized over the last 2 years, and especially, with online teaching, and I'm sure for comedians, this is the same kind of deal, where you don't get that immediate feedback from students. And for you as a comedian, kind of hard these last 2 years for a comedian to do anything like that. And so
it was I did 63 Zoom shows.
Wow. Yeah.
And I had done exactly none before COVID. I mean, this was all an invention of it. And it was truly, it was a better than nothing. Right. And that's all I can say for it. But you know what, you brought up a really good point, which is, I think that the idea was we will continue to do what we were doing live and in person on our computers, because I think one of the things that people have already forgotten about COVID is we didn't know it was going to be this long. Some people said they knew, some people said they had a feeling we knew, but regardless, I think everyone was living that entire 2 years about 2 weeks at a time.
Right.
Going, it's almost sure by my birthday, by Easter, it'll be over by Christmas, I'm sure by then. And so we were sort of making these little stopgaps. Whereas if we had collectively been like, it's going to be 2 entire years, maybe we would have, done this a little differently. But I think the biggest reinvention of what stand-up comedy is because of COVID, I think is best demonstrated by Bo Burnham's Inside. Did you see that?
I did not.
I could not recommend it more strongly. Do you know who Bo Burnham is?
The name is very familiar.
He's a fantastic comedian that really has been around for a while. I remember him having some shows on Comedy Central in like the very, very, very early days of like YouTube pseudo streaming. He's always sort of been very good at like the self camera, self shooting, faux documentary style kind of comedy. And he makes hilarious parody songs. So sort of a Weird Al-esque, guy. He doesn't necessarily parody other people's songs, but like funny songs. And he did this comedy special during COVID that, like the rest of us, he didn't know how long it was going to go. So he sort of turns, when he starts off, he's kind of clean shaven and he's got short hair. And it's one of those, adjust the camera and like, okay, and I'm going to do my songs and quick edits. And then it turns into like pseudo Castaway. His hair gets longer and longer and his eyes get more sunken and he gets more introspective and darker and reflecting a lot of what was happening with all of us, especially the entertainers here in LA. We were so trapped. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
it was and so there was no really, and his songs are so funny and so satirical and so dark. And it's so beautiful and so interesting. And it really was, how does a comedian who's used to the audience and the community of other comedians and the sound of laughter, also trying to make jokes in what is one of the darkest times we've ever lived through.
Yeah.
And I think that it's great to see. It's hugely entertaining, but I think that people will study it in the future.
I hope they do.
Like, how did COVID and modern technology collide to generate a whole new way of performing yourself? You know what I mean? Putting yourself out there. It's so good.
Sounds like a perfect primary source of the last 2
years. It is
a
perfect primary source. In fact, and he just won, I believe he just won a Grammy for one of the songs in the special. Put Your Hands Up. So good. So yes, great primary source. You'll love it.
It is. I mean, and everything is a primary source, but that is even better because like you said, it couldn't have come at any other time, but
couldn't have come at any time.
All of this. I mean, just the fact that through social media, I contacted you and said, and then without even thinking about it, I mean, as we're talking to each other, the amazing technology that's being used just to make it seem like, we're on the other side of a room from each other is incredible. And we're just
incredible.
And it's become so standard over the last 2 years that it's like, this is, I guess, one of the good things that's come from the pandemic is that we have realized the need to be together, but ways to do it without necessarily being physically together, even if one is more optimal than the other, but it is something just to marvel at. And I'm glad that and leave it to a comedian to be the one to be the most poignant about it. I mean, that's where it comes down to is I usually find that comedians are the most intelligent people around. And that's why it's perfect that, so you're also a historian and even if you haven't said that, it's very clear from everything you've been saying so far. And I feel like, the smartest people tend to be historians and derive so much from that. It's like and you can always tell a smart comedian from a not so smart one, and it's usually the smart ones that last longer and are more well known and iconic. So I got to ask about, the reason I contacted you in the first place was about those comedy records, like the real blue ones of the 50s, 60s, the Lenny Bruce's, the Joan Rivers, that era, Don Rickles. When it comes to that, why do you think they made those records? Was it just because there was no way those people would ever end up on television at that time? Even if they did show up on the Tonight Show, they really had to water down their stylings. What was the marketplace for that kind of record? Like, who was buying them?
Yeah, I mean, they really seemed to be a response to the mainstream, which so much of this is, right? It's action and reaction, the mainstream and then the subculture and this sort of endless tangle that they do.
Hmm.
But once television dominated stand up and the performance market, which started in the 1940s and 50s with the Texaco theater, which was Milton Berle had a
Hmm.
variety show first, and then of course Ed Sullivan came up after that, and Milton Berle was like the biggest, most successful, and then it slowly shifted, and Ed Sullivan became the biggest, most sensational name, and television, of course, was heavily censored. So what comedians they featured had to be squeaky, squeaky, squeaky clean. And it wasn't just not saying fuck. It was the subject. You can't mention that someone was divorced. Your joke can't include, married, unmarried
Right.
people having the implication that unmarried people are having sex, or drunk. You can't talk about someone getting drunk. I mean, these are like crazy squeaky clean. And there were still some very, very funny comedians that could navigate within those boundaries and still tell very funny stuff. But often then that comedy doesn't really transcend time because they're probably talking about real current events. So if you think about right now, if I tell you jokes about Nancy Pelosi, you may get it. Some people may get, even if
Hmm.
they're not terribly politically savvy, Nancy Pelosi is a woman, a high ranking
Hmm.
Democrat. A lot of people don't like her, even if that's all that you needed to know for that joke to work.
Right.
In 10 years, no one's going to know what Nancy Pelosi means. Even a Watergate joke.
Yeah.
I mean, Watergate, 1972, dominated the everything. It was Watergate, 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 the trial. I mean, my God, the president is going to be impeached.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, I mean, it was nuts. And people were devouring this stuff. And so there were names that circulated during Watergate, like Martha Mitchell and John Mitchell, that were household names in 1972. So if I'm a comic in 1972 and I say, at least I'm not married to Martha Mitchell, the audience would
Right.
fucking die because everyone knew
Right.
who she was and I didn't have to go after it. Now, if I, tell a joke about the attorney general's wife, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
Martha Mitchell is like, who is it? You know what I mean? Whereas if you're telling real universal jokes about what it's like raising kids, that joke might transcend several more decades because that's a
Mm.
funny scenario that everyone can touch on for several more decades without having to know that cultural reference in order to understand it. You know what I mean? And so I think that the comedy records were comedians that wanted to be able to skewer public figures, talk about sex, talk about drunk, and knew that they weren't going to get onto television that way. And
Yeah.
then there was the market in Vegas. I mean, when Vegas came on the map and started doing huge shows, which was really largely in the 60s and 70s, they would have shows 24 hours a day. I mean, there would
Mhm.
be a 2 a.m. show that started, in the book, betting area, whatever. And those comedians were getting paid like $10,000 a week. So for
Oh,
them, they were like, why would I record an album?
right.
It wasn't about being clean. It wasn't about censorship. It was like, if I record an album, everyone's heard my jokes. So
Right.
who's going to come down and listen to me do a set every week at the Bellagio when they
Mhm.
can pay $5 and hear it in their living room every night? So it was also a way for unknown comedians
Yeah.
to get their material out there, which is very much like what we have now with TikTok and YouTube. It's like there'd be no reason for Kevin Hart to do a TikTok video
Right.
unless he was selling a product or there
Right.
was
Right.
something else going on. But for an unknown comedian, yeah, get on TikTok every hour and get your stuff out
Mhm.
there because it is a different kind of tool for you.
That's a really good point. I mean, just that kind of middle level comedian, like
Mhm.
if you're being paid lots of money, why would you, because the same thing happened to a lot of vaudevillians in the early days of film, where they were glad to record themselves doing their bit or their performance, for the early those Nickelodeon type programs, those movies that Edison's company was putting out.
Mhm.
But then they're like, wait a minute, I'm doing it once, I'm being paid once, totally ruin, who's going to come see me now if I am, when next time I'm on tour or whatever, who's
Yeah.
going to come, pay money that night. And so
Yeah.
they lost a lot of money and
Yeah.
didn't necessarily have that you know, a lot of times when I do these kinds of things in my classroom, and when it comes to like a record, I ask, you know, who the intended audience is of the record. And I almost always have a student that says the future. You know, they weren't necessarily making it for the people at the time. They were making it so that their voice, in this case, would be heard for all time. That, you know, as long as people were listening to recorded sound, that you wouldn't necessarily be their fans in that era. It would be something that, you know, somebody could pass down to their own kids or find somewhere at a record store, or, you know, just have on hand. And you know, there it is. And so it's almost like, and that's why the funniest ones are the ones that tell timeless kind of relatable situations. It's not just, like you said, current events, you know, of the 50s, 60s. It's more like, you know, and even that, I think that mid-century post World War II era is the origin place of where we are now, where, you know, everything from the way the family was designed to child rearing to the patterns of your life, you know, when you go to college, if you go to college, who you marry, you know, when you have kids, all those kinds of things really are a product of the Second World War. And so comedians of pre 1940s probably don't have that same, I mean, there's some funny stuff from, you know, the 30s and the 20s and backwards, but that relatability of reacting to modern life is something that, you know, modern life really showed up in that era, you know, the mid-century. So would you say that there's a demographic in particular that comedians tend to derive from? Maybe not necessarily ethnic or whatnot, but as far as like maybe like socioeconomic, does it seem like almost every socioeconomic part of the country has its own voice in comedy?
Yeah, I think but that's an interesting question. I think that if you did a survey, you would probably find that comedians, writers, and performers of comedy do come from every socioeconomic background. But I do think that there is an effort by every comedian to be the common man. So I think that in general, you know, comedians are still trying to reflect their audience, which is sort of a working class everyman. You know what I mean? To the point where, like, Jeff Foxworthy, for example, you know, Jeff Foxworthy, famous for "You Might Be a Redneck If," and I think his tour was even called the Blue Collar.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring
tour.
that up. Yeah, and it was...
he is rich. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country, and he is a rich kid. And so that is, once people find out that Jeff Foxworthy was always wealthy, I mean, that he's wealthy now is sort of like, sure, because you're a successful comedian, but like,
he had that awesome show.
It was also a little bit changed, you know, it changes it a little bit because it feels like he's been punching down his whole career. That it's like him and these sort of golf club swilling rich guys who are sort of making fun of rednecks.
Right.
Like, you know, we hear a Southern accent, we sort of assume he's talking about his friends and family, but all of a sudden you're like,
Yeah.
I'm not, and I make no judgments. I think Jeff Foxworthy is very funny and he's, you know, free to do whatever he wants. But I think that the general perception of everyone is that comedians are generally, you know, like Eddie Murphy's story, you know, just like poor kids who, you know, told jokes to not get in trouble at school, and then it worked out for him. It is true. I will say this from my experience out here in the world, is that comedians are often sad. That much is true. I'm not. I don't think I'm a sad person. I'm actually one of the few who's like, hey, that was a great set. Everybody having fun. I think it's why I'm an MC. But it does surprise me sometimes, even in the business. You know, I'll see someone on stage, they're so effervescent, they're so funny, they're so engaging, they're even improvising with the crowd. And I'll kind of, you know, hey man, that was a great set. And you really get a kind of like, thank you.
Weird.
And then they go home and you're like, oh, you were performing. You were pretending, you know, or whatever. You know, people's social anxiety can be its own thing. But I think sometimes, you know, what people are doing on stage is definitely a performance of something.
Right. Yeah, I hear that all the time about different, and again, I'll even go back as a teacher, I put on a different performance in a way. Like I have my kind kind of self-effacing, style of, or overly egotistical version of myself that I put up there.
Sure.
It is a performance in a way.
And you have to sell it, because
Yeah.
I think that education and comedy, your comparisons are so appropriate because, you need them to digest and comprehend this thing you're talking about. If they don't actually remember this stuff and absorb this stuff, then you're not doing their job and they're not going to succeed by passing the test, right? And it's very similar for me. If you don't understand that I'm setting up that my parents are really, really conservative, I need you to get that. Because if you don't get that my parents are really conservative, then my punchline of my tattoos and dope smoke aren't going to be as funny. You know what I mean? So I can see how it's like, whatever I need to do to establish this premise in your mind, I have to do so that later I can subvert it or whatever I'm going to do to make it funner.
It's something that, I find that, going back to the demographic part, it is the everyman approach that you really have to, because if you try to project yourself as just, an elite or some kind, something about in all these different fields, you're going to turn a lot of people off. It's like if Jeff Foxworthy had gotten up there and be like, well, by the way, when I was staying at one of my houses,
no, exactly,
it just
exactly
wouldn't work with that crowd nearly
exactly
as much.
right. And you also find too, you probably know as a teacher, when you can very strategically slide in that story about you doing something naughty.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because your students are looking at you as a teacher. And if you start talking about that time you went on that motorcycle trip across the country, that they're going to kind of, like, I'm sorry, what? And maybe you sell it a little bit because you're like, yeah, I need you. And it's similar as, even as a woman, it's like, I'm not sexualizing myself, but like, if I need to get the audience to follow me down a certain road, you know what I mean? I probably am not going to talk about my husband for a while because I need y'all to be kind of excited about me as a possible sexual opportunity for you. And so you find that there's information and there's ways that you build things up. And when you deliver information to sort of be the subtext of a story,
Right. I'm imagining for a comedian, it takes a while probably to develop that particular skill. And would you say that might be the skill that decides who stays in the comedy world or not, right? Is if you can't.
Sure.
Really...
I mean, inadvertently or inadvertently. I mean, I think about someone, for example, like John Mulaney. You know John Mulaney? I think he's so funny. And he presents as a kind of a nerd. Do you know what I mean? He wears
like a tie. Suit and tie.
He wears a suit and tie, and he's very his movements are very sort of TED talky and appropriate. And he doesn't really even talk about stuff that is that. I mean, he's so funny. It's hard to compartmentalize his humor, but he's not like fart jokes, shit jokes. Like he's very, intelligent. And in his private life, which was recently broadcast, he was in and out of rehab a couple of times and had some different. And I think that was one of those things that people who absorb him only from his onstage persona had a hard time justifying, because he doesn't seem like a rock star who does a ton of drugs. Right. You know what I mean? He doesn't talk about his drug use as like a thing. And it's sort of like, he didn't talk about that stuff. It's probably because it's not funny.
Yeah.
It's probably, I suspect we're going to hear about it now because, he's going to have to bring up some of that material. But, that was sort of one where you were like, versus somebody like Jeff Foxworthy, who's probably trying really hard not to iron his jeans, to look like a real common man, and he gets out there. So
I hope Jeff Foxworthy doesn't necessarily tune into this podcast.
I'm sure he will.
I'm looking for a new podcast. EPS podcast. There it is.
Don Brodey sucks.
Yeah. That's going to be his next special.
Yeah. You might be a dumb Don Brodey if
host a game show called Are You Smarter Than Don Brodey?
No, nobody
this is. Show is entirely about trashing her. That's my
come on, Jeff. Come on. I said you were funny.
We like Larry the Cable Guy. Well, he's another one too. I think that I heard somewhere that he wasn't like that at all. That he's not that's a persona that because who could be like that, honestly. Actually, I know lots of people like that, but
but you know what I saw him actually, I forget what commercial he did. He was on some commercial for I don't know, acid reflux or something. And he had like really nice veneers, like very nice, expensive veneers. I was like, I don't know how long you're going to be able to wear these torn off flannels with those $100,000 teeth. But
Right.
you know who else was one of the first like this, I think, that I encountered, and I've never met him personally, but I saw in an interview and was like, whoa, was Steve Martin. Steve Martin is actually not really gregarious and funny, like Robin Williams was jumping all over the couch and is always funny and is kind of always Robin Williams. But like Steve Martin is very serious. He has a PhD and he like talks, at length about stuff without making jokes. And I forget who was interviewing him, but said, boy, you're not very funny. And he said, I'm not at work.
There it is.
I'm not working. So no.
Yeah. Like you have to pay for the funny, I'm not going to just do it.
Yeah.
On
Whereas,
the fly.
With Robin Williams, I think 2 minutes in, you're like, where's the off button?
Yeah. He was
rest his soul. Rest his soul.
And a lot of these, I mean, we seem to have lost a lot of giants in the comedy world in just the last few months, starting with Norm Macdonald, Bob Saget, and then most recently Gilbert Gottfried. And he was Gilbert Gottfried is another one where, the few times that you could hear his actual voice, it was very clear that he's not that guy, and just like that squinched up, and holding on to the way he worked the microphone and the mic stand, constantly adjusting it, and just kind of like just projecting that feeling of just the just really overly stressed out and confused and angry little guy, just worked so well, because then you could get glimmers of it when he did impressions of other people.
Yeah,
which is always the funniest, when he would just like drop that and then go into doing his Jerry Seinfeld impression, or somebody, and just like, whoa, that's just to see him turn it off like that so quickly. It was these are comedians are some of the most smartest, like I said, and talented chameleon like type people. So I would say, and so the behaviors and ideas that it conveys, we've touched on a lot over the last hour or so, but stand-up comedy does exist all around the world. But it seems like North America is where there's a lot of comics from North America. And I know Montreal is kind of like the, I don't know if it's self-proclaimed or not, but it's like the Just for Laugh festival is in Montreal, and they have the Museum of Comedy there. I used to go to Montreal like every weekend when I was a teenager, because we lived so close by. We would just go over the border, and it would just be, I don't know, like Canadian humor is just slightly different from American enough that it's kind of like, we always joke that it seemed like Canadians have like a part of their brain that they like, psychically connect with each other. Like it is like, they'll like
jazz,
right? Like we just like be in an Expos game or something, and they flash something on the big screen, and even if it wasn't in French, it would just be like a picture of like a guy talking to a horse or something like that. And everyone's like, yeah, like erupting in laughter, and all the Americans are like, huh? Like, but they would host that Just for Laughs festival. And sometimes they'd even have, Canadian stand-ups, and they just wasn't quite the same as an American one. But still, North America seems to be where there's just so many, like it's the culture of stand-up comedy. Do you think that it's just because it matches our cultural values so well, that as Americans, and we really value freedom of expression, and of being able to say what you want in any venue?
Yeah, I do. I think that's certainly probably some of the beating heart of it. You're right. I think it's an art form that originated in North America. I mean, once you suss it out from like other performing styles and stuff like that. I think the nature of our sort of national fabric of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, I think, combined with the technology of once the railroad headed west, then the electricity lines, telephone lines, what I mean, headed west, that these ideas follow. And I think it also was part of what sort of helped build a national fabric. What was funny, if you could make fun of the president in this city, in this city, in this city, sort of links those places together, that their humor is unified. And I think that's a really good question. I think it's not only that we as individuals are perhaps disproportionately encouraged to speak our minds, but we also have an audience for it. People like to hear what other people are saying, and then combined with the technology, and then combined with our entertainment. I mean, we were also, the early adapters and originators of entertainment on the radio and film and television. And so once you've sort of unlocked that area, it feels like it can thrive within itself,
I think I've covered the last thing already. I think we just wrapped it up by saying it, that the best comedy is almost 100% descriptive. It's stuff that, like, when somebody does parody, it's this close to, it's paper thin from reality. So I loved I've actually never watched The American Office, but I love the UK Office, because when I was flipping the channels one time and I came across BBC America, I didn't realize it was a comedy show. I thought it was a real documentary. I was just like, and then like a few minutes into it, I'm like, oh wait, that's hilarious. Oh, and there's a guy on YouTube that takes those how it's made mini documentaries, and he makes it's called How It's Really Made, and he matches his voice perfectly to the narrator of the How It's Made things, how a battery is made, just slides in. And so the first time I watched it, I thought I was watching a legitimate, because I'm always curious. I'm like, how do they make crayons? And I'm watching this thing, and then I'm like, did he just say I'm like, what? And he, like, the voice and the cadence is perfect. And so I always think that that's the best comedy, and that's parody, obviously, but even on stage, the comedians, like we've been saying all along, that can relate to the audience, have that broad spectrum of, that wide appeal and array, that he can tell the same jokes in Maine as he can in California and get the same kind of response, is where we, that's great comedians. And it must come from the era of when comedians first started getting broadcasted, then mid-century or so. Just trying to have a broad appeal, so you can travel, you can tour, you can sell records, you can, you want to have as many ears as possible, right? That's the same thing for podcasting too. So isn't it just? Thank you so much for joining the EPS podcast, and I'm hoping that we can share listeners. If people like what they hear on the EPS podcast, please go right over to the HILF podcast and take a listen to, just I love all the different topics that you cover. And it's like that, like you said it so well earlier, it's like, you might kind of see something on the History Channel or, read something in a book, but you really do a great job with comedians digging deeply and seeing the fun stuff in there. So, well, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. It's been great talking with you. Well, thank you so much. And for everybody else out there, join us again on the EPS podcast, where everything, including stand-up comedy, is a primary source. Thank you again, Don Brodey. Thank you. Bye. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast almost as much as I enjoyed making it. Please like, subscribe, and otherwise follow the show to hear future episodes. Back episodes can be found at epspodcast.club or wherever you get your podcasts. The EPS podcast can be found on social media, including Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/EPS podcast. Join me next time on the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.